everyone. Welcome to the Courage Conversation Show. I'm your host, Ashley Easter,
And I'm Maureen Garcia.
and we are going to be co-hosting this show together today, and we're going to be bringing on a very special guest. And just so you know, every Thursday we are here at 7 p.m. Eastern. We do the show, and you can watch us on all the major social media platforms from Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, all the places. We also have our replays at courage365.org/video, so you can catch our back episodes. Today we're going to be interviewing a beautiful soul, a friend, mentor, just an all-around great person. Her name is Linda Kay Klein, and I'm just going to read her bio really quickly before we bring her onto the show. So Linda Kay Klein is the founder and president of the Break Free Together, a nonprofit storytelling organization dedicated to helping people release shame and claim their whole selves. Plus, she is a deconstruction and purity culture recovery coach. She is the author of the award-winning book, Pure, Inside the Evangelical Movement That Shamed a Generation of Women and How I Broke Free. And that book is super amazing. It really, I think, rocked the evangelical and even evangelical world for a bit there and is still having ripple effects and impact. Such an important book. So without further ado, let me invite Linda onto the show. Hey, Linda, how are you?
Hi. I'm doing great. How are you doing?
So good. And Maureen, I'm super excited that we're going to be co-hosting today because I know you've also followed Linda's work, and you have such a way with asking questions that I just, maybe right out of the gate, we can just have you pitch a question to Linda, because
Sure.
I cannot wait to just dive right in.
All right, so I'm going to take a look at my notes. So I think the first thing we need to do is, for any listeners who aren't familiar with the term, can you give us an overview of what purity culture is?
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, well, first of all, I will just, full disclosure, say that I think I define it a little bit differently than some people do. So for me, purity culture is any culture that teaches that people are defined at their sort of essence by whether they are pure or impure, worthy or unworthy, lovable or lucky, if any good person will ever love them, despite the fact that they are deeply undeserving, right? As defined by other people's perceptions of their gender performance and their sexuality. So there are a lot of cultures that kind of sum the world up into you are good or bad, you are worthy or unworthy, you are pure or impure, that go beyond just the culture that I particularly focus on, which is the white American evangelical Christian church. And the words purity in some of these cultures are replaced with other words, like in Mormon culture, it would be worthiness, right? In Islam, it would be honor, right? So there are different words, and there are certainly many, groups that are non-religious that are teaching these same ideas. But that purity culture that I would say has been around for a very long time and continues to I want to say the word thrive, but it feels so wrong to say the word thrive, but the culture certainly does, right? Globally, really was amped up by the purity movement. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what that is. And I wanted to kind of give that as a basis, though, because some people, when they talk about what is purity culture, they are talking about the purity movement only, right? Whereas I sort of see purity culture as something a little bit bigger. So the purity movement started in the early 90s and went through to the early 2000s, started to go down around 2008. It was a movement that was intentionally formed and shaped by the white American evangelical Christian church to take these concepts of defining people as good or bad, et cetera, based on the gender and sexuality, took that idea and amped it up to the absolute nth degree within this culture. So suddenly the lives of people who were raised evangelical, particularly within that form of evangelicalism, we're saturated with extreme versions of these teachings. And we start to see, products come out like purity rings and purity pledges and purity balls and all these purity curricula and purity pop music and all kinds of things, right? And you start to see an intensification of the teachings. So now you have people who are not just teaching abstinence only before marriage messaging, but you have people who are also teaching, no sexual thought, no sexual feeling. And that becomes mainstream even within that community, which is a massive community. No dating, because dating itself is dangerous. So instead we should court one another with the full involvement of one another's families for marriage, right? And don't even go out on a date. That would be unsafe. That would be, potentially sinful. So it gets more and more extreme. It gets more and more noisy because we had a lot of money from the federal government, much of which required state matches for abstinence only before marriage messaging. And that population was the population teaching those things. So all of a sudden, the teachings within that population ballooned, right? And there was also a very intentional spread to take those messaging in oftentimes their most extreme form, the forms that I just described, and to spread it in a more diluted extent anyway, into all kinds of other cultures, public schools across the country, grassroots organizations, many of which got their funding from the federal and state level. And so therefore there was kind of this marriage that way. International aid for things like HIV, just huge international efforts, both those that were funded by the government and those that weren't, from this kind of purity movement. So you really saw this kind of baseline culture, which was kind of the foundation, right? You saw this thing get built up on top of it and built and built and built and built and broadened and broadened and broadened and broadened. It's almost like you took this like little town. This metaphor is coming to me for the first time, so we'll see if it makes sense. But it's almost like purity teachings within this culture, within this country, were like a little town that were the extreme versions of the purity teachings. We're a little town that were like kind of off on the side. People are like, oh, somebody's doing these purity ring daddy-daughter dances things. That's not mainstream though. And all of a sudden that town, in those years that I described, built high rises and now has suburbs and huge. It has become this, massive, massive influential industry town, right? Or industry city, right? That has had global impacts.
It got so big that at some point, it's so mainstream that you had celebrities who were coming out and saying that they had participated in these kind of purity culture contracts or purity movement contracts that, I'm going to stay abstinent until marriage. And they had, they'd publicly wear their purity rings. It was an interesting,
including some that today you might be surprised, for those who don't remember that time, like the Jonas Brothers, Miley Cyrus, right? Folks who we still know today who, like many of us, I think have come to a different relationship with these things. I apologize, by the way, I'm in New York City, so if you hear sirens,
no worries.
You can think of it as a soundtrack for what we're talking about.
The emergency.
This is an emergency, y'all. Yes.
And a funny story. So I had a purity ring. I bought one for myself that was kind of a cheap $10 one from, remember when Christian bookstores used to be kind of popular and they'd have the shirts that were,
modest
knockoffs, yes, or knockoffs of Reese's Pieces. It'd be Jesus something or another, but I got one that said pure, and then for my 16th birthday, my dad bought me one, and it was a real deal ring. It had 3 diamonds in there, and then when I got married, we actually took those diamonds and put them in my husband's wedding band, underneath, which is an expensive process, honestly, and we they're just there, which I guess
underneath you mean you can see them
inside the band. Yeah, you can't see them inside the band.
You can't see them even.
Yeah. And part of that was because he's not a flashy
know that
guy.
he has your virginity. Yeah.
But then we deconstructed
encapsulated in gold, right? So that no one can even see it sparkle. Yeah.
Exactly. But then we deconstructed and one of them fell out and got lost. And so it just seems like a metaphor. Oh, anyway,
Wow.
I laugh so I don't cry because it was like, wow,
Yes.
that was intense. But yeah,
Mhm.
totally did
Yeah.
Yeah.
that. Oh my
So
gosh.
this whole movement became so mainstream that it's still within a lot of evangelical church cultures being taught. In
Absolutely.
spite of your book and many other books and many people coming forward and saying how damaging this was for them. So here, in your book, Pure, you tell a story about Dr. Tina Shermer Sellers,
Mhm.
a professor at a Christian university. She was baffled when she noticed an increase in religious shame and gender-based shame that she eventually contributed to the damage that purity culture inflicted upon her students. And even
Mm.
more concerning, her claim was that, quote, the symptoms I'm seeing are exactly the same symptoms I might see in someone who was sexually abused.
Mhm.
Um, what have you noticed about the intersection of purity culture and abuse, and about how this purity movement can cause the same type of damage as sexual abuse?
Yeah. Yeah, the reason I was really excited to interview Tina or Dr. Shermer Sellers, who
Mhm.
also has a book out about this, um, is because, she and I basically found the same thing but came from different angles. I grew up in purity culture, so I've spent 16 years interviewing people raised in purity culture, and among them I found people had their lives looked indistinguishable in many cases from people who had experienced capital T sexual traumas like a rape, right? Or molestation, et cetera. And, Dr. Shermer Sellers came at it from the exact opposite angle. She didn't grow up in purity culture. She,
Mhm.
but worked with people who had been survivors, right? And
Right.
then found among these people that she was working with, or particularly with among her students that were
Yes. Mhm.
going to school to be able to support people as therapists, that there was a massive influx, particularly upon the purity movement, as people started to graduate out of the purity movement and grow up out of the purity
Right.
movement, of people who were experiencing these things but who didn't have capital T trauma. And she found the
Right.
commonality among them was purity culture. So anyway, so we kind of, what I think is really helpful about that is that to me, it felt really important to show that you could see it from either angle. You could either, look at a broad population,
Right.
and see
Mhm.
the symptoms and then say, what do they have in common? Purity culture. Or what I did, look at people raised in purity culture, see the symptoms and say, what do they have in common? Their lives are indistinguishable in many cases, from those who have experienced capital T sexual trauma, right?
Mhm.
So yes, so I have a lot to say on that as a result, right? One of the things that I have come to increasingly understand is the term sexual violence, I think, is actually really misleading in some cases.
Yes.
You know,
Absolutely.
yeah, for many years, I think growing up, I thought that sexual violence required physical violence, right?
Mhm.
Like, the kind of thing that you would, you know, there would be kicking and screaming and bruising, right?
Right.
Right.
And
Mhm.
of course, now I know that because of many things, including the very common freeze reaction or fawn
Yep.
reaction, or all the ways that we try to protect ourselves and survive, oftentimes we might not see the markings of physical violence.
Mhm.
And yet there is still this form of violence, that is something bigger, right?
Mhm.
I've started to increasingly use the word violation, right?
Yes.
Um,
Mhm.
and
Good.
um, and one of the things that what we experience in purity culture, people who are raised in purity culture, is, I would say, very much a form of sexual violation,
Mhm.
which is violence. And by that I mean, in the same way that you would experience if you saw physical violence, there is a similar set of conditions. In purity culture, we have no choice. There's no opportunity for consent, and therefore there's no consent
Right.
given.
Right.
You have no choices, period. Right?
Mhm.
You are essentially in a very similar sort of disconnect to save your own life, kind of state, that some survivors might find themselves in, right? So I feel like there's a similar kind of removal of agency,
Yep.
and you know, some of those other sort of larger concepts that happens among people who are raised in purity culture. So,
Hypervigilance comes to mind too. I know a lot of
Yeah.
survivors have to become hypervigilant, and when you're in purity culture, like you're always, on the lookout
hypervigilant.
for how can I not get abused because I'm wearing, the right clothes, that kind of thing.
Mhm.
Right, because I'll be in danger. I'll be in
Mhm.
danger if I'm discovered and, you know, wearing the wrong thing or whatever it is. Yeah, exactly. So that's a good example of ways that in which the lives look the same. So I'll give you some other examples would be like disconnection from body,
Yep.
disconnection from feelings, a
Mhm.
state of fear or a state of anxiety that is so great that it's almost PTSD like in its
Yeah.
experiences, um, disassociation.
Mhm.
All of these things are very, very common in my experience among people who are raised in purity culture, to the point where oftentimes they're seeing therapists and their therapists are like, you must have suppressed
Yep.
some capital
Mhm.
T sexual trauma. Why would you be experiencing these things if not? Right.
Right.
And so many people who I work with and support these days have been going through all of these efforts to try to figure out, what have I suppressed, what have I suppressed, something, and certainly, sometimes we do suppress things and sometimes things are revealed, but increasingly I think that we're starting to understand and recognize the way that a totalizing toxic theology or toxic worldview and
Yeah.
toxic community reiterating that worldview can have a very, very similar impact on your sort of internal life.
Yep. Absolutely. Yeah. Um, it reminds me of a number of years ago, you and I were having a conversation about community grooming. And this kind
Mm,
of cultural teaching is a type of community grooming. And with my research and my experience, and it seems to me that grooming in and of itself, before any other type of physical violation has taken place, is itself abusive. And it seems
mm,
that you and Dr. Shermer Seller's research kind of, you know, points to that as well. That without
mhm.
actually experiencing what you call capital T trauma, that being taught these things and having, you know, being within that kind of community that polices that kind of stuff, that itself is um, sexual violence, sexual violation,
Yes.
traumatic. Mhm. Yeah.
Yes.
So,
Well, and that makes me think of, one of the things that I've learned is that there is the traumatic event when we're talking about a
mhm.
capital T trauma, and then there's the trauma of everything that happens after the traumatic
Yep.
event that that is its own, chapter of trauma, right?
Yep.
All of the
Mhm.
self blame, all of other people blaming you, all of da 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 da. And to your point, when a community has been groomed,
Mhm.
all of that stuff, that's just everyday practice.
Yep.
All of
Mhm.
the it's your fault, all of the, internalized it's my fault, that is just part of the water.
Yep.
And that is a huge part of all of this.
Yeah, it's horrible. So, in Pure, you also write about the difficulty of finding therapists and counselors, which you talked a little bit about, that can understand and treat the damage caused by the toxic messages of purity culture. Um, so, what do you think needs to change?
Hmm.
And what should we look for in a therapist or counselor if we need to, if we become aware that this is one of the things we need to treat?
Yeah. Well, one of the things that I think is interesting is, in general, I think when people, particularly within the therapeutic community, but I think perhaps just
Mhm.
in general, we tend to, many of us, put religion into an all good or all bad category.
Mm.
Um, and the reality is, that religion is an extended family. And we would
Mhm.
never say, that family, that every family is good or that every
Yeah.
family is bad or healthy or unhealthy or that every aspect of your family is healthy or unhealthy, right?
Right.
But when it comes to religion, we do tend to think that way. We tend to kind of have this kind of binary, totalizing attitude around religion, and I find
Mhm.
that that is very true among and plays into some therapists and their approach. You have Christian therapists. And when I say Christian, I'm putting in quotes because that usually is code for evangelical therapists. So we're not just talking about a therapist who happens to be Christian, but a Christian therapist, right? Generally means an evangelical therapist, who are oftentimes, not always to be sure, but are oftentimes going to be reiterating those same shaming messages, right? And so you come to them with your shame and they say, well, maybe you need to confess to God. And, so now the shame spiral goes deeper and deeper.
Not to mention those who call themselves counselors but aren't even therapists. They're actually just, euthetic counselors. That's even a whole other grouping. Yeah.
Yeah. And then you have, more secular therapists. And I find that secular therapists too are victim to this kind of all good or all bad stuff. And oftentimes they don't want to touch religion. Some of them feel like, listen, I'm not religious, but I understand that religion is a great community and a great resource and a great support to people. And therefore, yeah, well, we're gonna, what do we don't really need to talk about religion being harmful, and then there are others who are like, religion, I can't believe that. What did you experience there? That's, moving on. Let's talk about these other things. Like, that's just awful. And I don't know why you stayed. And anyway, either way, you're not looking at the complexity. You're not looking at the nuance. You're not looking at, you're not looking at period at all. Right. So I find that, we really need more education, among the therapeutic community around religion in general. We also, from what I understand, from talking with a lot of therapists, is that there's not sufficient training in sexuality either. So here you are, you're somebody who has experienced a mixture. No worries. Listen, I just started over, so I'll start over again, and then we won't have your sneeze. And people also don't have sufficient training oftentimes when it comes to sexuality in a traditional program if they don't go above and beyond.
Sorry.
That's wonderful. But I would say two things. One, a therapist who's willing to learn and not just listen to you and have you lead, because that isn't always, of course, helpful, to have to lead yourself. But someone who's willing to learn, in their own time to be able to help you, right? Who's willing to read a little bit more, understand your community better. That's a really next level therapist, but they are definitely out there. And then the other thing is, you might find different forms of healing in different places. You might have a therapist with whom you work on your complex PTSD, and someone else, like a coach like me, who you work with on purity culture deconstruction specifically, right? We much like, no one person is going to be your be all end all in love and relationships. No one person is going to be your be all end all in walking alongside you to release shame and trauma either.
Hey, this is Ashley Easter, and I'm interrupting this interview to tell you something really exciting that Courage 365 is now offering for our community. One of our values at Courage 365 is to help survivors live with courage every day. And one way we're doing that is by sending out morning inspirational texts written by survivors for survivors in the Courage 365 community. All you have to do is text the word courage to the number on the screen, and you'll be automatically added to the list.
So you just mentioned that you're a purity culture recovery coach, right? So you do that for individuals and for groups. Plus, you're the founder and president of this Break Free Together nonprofit. And it's a storytelling organization. You've said, every time I tell my story, I am closer to free. What is it about telling our stories to facilitate healing and transformation? And what do you mean by that? Every time I tell my story, I'm closer to free.
Yeah, I mean, this is, just like 101 Brene Brown shame stuff in some sense, right? Shame creates silence. We find ourselves either beating ourselves up and in that way disconnecting from others, just totally focused on how awful we are, lashing out at others to keep them far away from us, so that that which we are ashamed will not, be seen by them, right? Or withdrawing or going into secrecy, in some way, shape, or form, silence and isolation around that of which we are most deeply ashamed. And the antidote, is to reveal. Justice Louis Brandeis once said, the best disinfectant is sunlight.
Yeah.
You know, and there really is something, I want to say, like almost like magical in its quality that can happen when in a space that is appropriately safe. No space is fully safe, right? But that is safe enough. We do the very thing that everything inside of us is screaming not to do, which is hide. And instead we reveal and we tell the truth, right? And particularly when we're held, when we tell the truth, either by someone else saying, me too, right? Or saying, I resonate with you. Maybe I haven't had that experience, but I hear you and I see you. Something really powerful happens inside of us, right? And it is. I love this sunlight is the greatest disinfectant, kind of frame because of the visual of that, right?
Yeah.
So it's powerful. It's powerful. One of the things that when I host in-person events, I have, I don't do it anymore, but, for a while I would bring postcards with me and have people write their story if they wanted to. And there was a sign that said, write your story for yourself, share it for someone else, because we were sharing them on Instagram. We still have them up on Instagram. We did that for a year. And so anyway, so the telling of it is for your own healing, right? But the sharing of it also, has this ripple effect, to use the word that you used previously, where other people are also, without even having said a word, having that experience, that same me too, that same, that same, like a little bit of light just hit me. I didn't even have to tell my story, but some of your light has shed light on me. Right.
Yeah.
So it really is an incredible tool. The truth.
Yeah, I love that image that your light can illuminate parts of someone else's shadow, even if they're not ready to tell their story yet. That's awesome.
Yeah.
So,
And I love that too. I don't mean to interrupt, but just I've so enjoyed this interview. And I appreciate the way that you've broadened the conversation around purity culture, because I think, like you'd said in the beginning, for a lot of people, it's just only the ideas of sexual purity within the white evangelical churches that have then spread out. And I know it does affect, African American churches and all that as well, but primarily started in the white evangelical church. But also how you broadened it out to just, the pure and good of, just how humans are supposed to be, quote unquote. And this question is kind of going off script, but it just kind of came up for me in hearing you talk about this. But we're going to be having a expert come in on the show in a few weeks who's going to be talking about body positivity, and who's going to be talking a bit about just particularly like a diet culture and how it's really harmed a lot of people, and how like even the dichotomy of like, this is clean food and that's dirty food, and just like who came up with that? Food is food, and like you eat what you eat. But I do appreciate that you've brought in that conversation, and then just getting back to what you said in that last question there about sharing your story. Have you found that in your conversations with people, not only them sharing their story around maybe direct abuse, or sharing their story around, the purity rings and all that kind of stuff, but have you seen the same benefit of people talking about other ways where they've been put in boxes of like, this is what it means to be good. Have you seen that story effect help pretty much in all those areas?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the things that is really, really important, I think, for people to understand if you're recovering from some of these types of
Mhm.
teachings is that you've got the teachings themselves,
Mhm.
um, and then you've got the frameworks of thought beneath the teachings. So, for example, the teaching, I am pure if I suppress all sexual thought or feeling, right? Is a teaching. A framework underneath that is pure exists,
Right.
and the antithesis of pure is impure, right? And a
Mhm.
teaching beneath that is, you know, the binary is the way to look at the world. Either ors, all but, no ands, right? This
Mhm.
or this, right? So oftentimes, when I'm working with folks, and I use that term working with folks because, really for the first, when I wrote the book, by the time the book came out, I think I had done 14 years of interviews. I did 12 years of interviews when I sat down and said, I'm going to start writing, right? And then since then, I've been really much more focused on recovery and working with folks who are in recovery, either via the nonprofit or via coaching, and learning from people who are in recovery,
Right.
um,
Mhm.
and have just learned, a whole new set of of things, right? That's not just about the pain, but that's about the healing. So anyway, so when I'm working with folks, one of the things that we often come upon pretty quickly is that perhaps, this top layer idea and this second layer idea underneath it have been revealed, but the base, that there is such a thing as a person being good or bad,
Mm,
or or religion being good or bad, or anything
Right.
being good or bad, right? As we were talking about before, is an example of like a deeper framework, right? So yes, absolutely, those deeper frameworks have massive impacts on people's lives that go way beyond sexuality. It's one of the reasons why, why you said I'm a deconstruction and purity culture recovery coach. I used to just say purity culture recovery. Most of the time, I still do, but the reality is that's just it's just part of the
Good.
conversation. Whether it's the way in which we work, to the point where our fingers are raw, and there's nothing
mm,
left of us to earn goodness, to earn worth, right?
yeah.
Or give to others of our time and our energy and our effort until we have nothing left for ourselves to earn goodness or to earn, right?
Mm.
Or, learn all the things that will make us a right and good and perfect ally, in order to earn goodness and earn rightness, right? All of these things, come from this I would say faulty teaching that there is any chance at us ever being wholly good, right?
Right.
Or
Mhm.
indeed wholly bad, right?
Mm.
So yes, all of these things are an absolute total world shaker. So I think that's one of the reasons that when people start to look at purity culture and start to face their sexual shame, it's really hard for the whole like Jenga tower not to come crashing, right? Like
Right.
you
Absolutely.
pull,
Mhm.
you pull out that piece and all of a sudden it's like, oh my gosh, that piece is tied to all of it and the whole balance is just, so it's scary. It's scary to do this work, but it's also, on the other side of that falling apart is the rebuilding,
Mm.
Mhm. Yeah.
Beautiful. Thank you for that.
Yeah.
That was excellent. That whole, yeah, that gives me a lot to process and think about
Mm.
because it leads to, the teaching is the teaching, but the teaching, like you said, there are foundational ways that you begin to look at the world.
Yes.
Um, and many of them are absolutely false. So that's a terrifying thing to try to face that everything you know is potentially wrong, you
Yeah.
know? Yeah. Um,
Yeah.
where can we find out more about your work and how can we contact you?
Yeah, you can find out more about my work at my website, which is my full name. So Linda, Linda. My middle name is Kay, my last name, Klein. So Linda Kay Klein.
Mhm.
.com. I always spell out my middle name because I think sometimes people think it's just the
It's a
letter
letter.
K, right?
Okay.
Yes. Mhm.
Which maybe I'll just briefly tell a story. When I was a kid, one of my favorite hilarious jokes was people would say, "What's your middle name?" And I would say, "I'll tell you the first letter and then you guess it." And then I would say K. And then they would eventually be like, "Just tell me." And I'd be like, "Okay, K." And they'd be like, "Just tell me." And I'd be like, "K."
That's cute. It's so cute. I love that.
Hilarious. Hilarious. Anyway, I started telling that young.
You were a little comedian. Yeah. I feel like some of our best jokes come either from things that happened in childhood or things that we realized worked as good comedy in childhood.
Totally.
Yep.
I mean, I started doing that living in a particular area, so I know I was between first and third grade, and I still feel like that joke works today.
Yes.
But anyway, so yes, you can find me on my website. You can reach out to me on my website. I will just say I am a little overwhelmed, so it takes me a minute to get back to people.
Right.
So please, forgiveness for that in advance. And if you want to get a hold of me sooner, you can find me on Instagram.
Mhm.
Awesome. Wow, Linda, thank you so much for all this. I mean, uh, yeah, this is your description of the whole movement was it shifted some things for me that was helpful. And I've been looking into
Mhm.
this and I've read your book already and I'm still learning new things. And so I just
Right.
Me
that
too.
depth of insight and Maureen, all the questions you brought forward, those are really powerful. Thank you for doing that. And yeah, everybody, we will definitely have the links and all of that stuff for Linda underneath this video, wherever you're watching it, whether that is on Facebook or YouTube, or if you're watching it, on our website, you'll be able to find those things pretty easily as well. And while you're in the following mood and you're following Linda's things, hop on over and make sure you're following Courage 365 on all of our platforms. We've got Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter. You can find us at all those places. And I would say go ahead and start following if you haven't, because we're going to be again talking about some really cool things that are coming up this fall. We're going to be doing another 30 Days of Courage event. I'm super excited about that. So you'll find a lot about that on our social media. And you can also hop on over to our website, courage365.org. And just for visiting, you can download this free ebook, 5 Keys to Living a Life of Courage, to help you take your next most courageous steps as a survivor. And from there, you can find back episodes of the show. If you need help and support, we have a Need Help tab you can click on and find different hotlines and resources and things that we've put together in one place for you. And of course, if you're in imminent danger or or suspect child abuse, go ahead and contact the authorities. But for other things, we have that great list compiled there for you to use. A couple of other exciting things, if you're not familiar with this already, we have started a podcast where we've taken all of these shows and we put them in podcast form. You can find that wherever you get your podcasts, Apple Podcasts, goodness, I always forget the other ones because that's the one that I use. But Spotify, all those places, you can download those if you prefer to listen to the audio version rather than the video version. Great for car trips and workouts, those kinds of things. And we're doing something really cool that we have just started. We are putting out morning empowerment texts for survivors every morning, 5 days a week. These are text messages created by survivors within the Courage 365 community for survivors. It's always going to be uplifting, empowering, talking about self-care, self-worth, those types of things. It's a great kind of shot in the arm in the morning to get your day going right. And we'll be putting more details out about that pretty soon. So make sure you are signing up for that as well. And thank you all so much for tuning in. This has been such an important conversation. If you know somebody who you think needs to hear this, and let's be honest, we all do, go ahead and hit that share button. Make sure everybody else can see this empowering and impactful conversation. And as always, want to thank you for being here and live with courage.